Hi everyone, and welcome back to Stephan podcast, brought to you by getbold.io. So for American listeners, you can go and buy Bitcoin over at getbold.io with a range of services there. Now, today we're going to be talking about the origins of the Federal Reserve, and joining me today is Julian, and rejoining is Peruvian Bull. So welcome to the show, guys.
Thanks for having us on.
Thanks for having me, man. Been a big fan for a while.
Well, thank you. Yeah, and so I saw the video you guys recently did. I thought it was great, and we need more people to understand what's going on with the Federal Reserve. So, but let's start with I like to start with why. So, why now? Why was this the right time to make this video?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I read the book, and if you've read the book from G. Edward Griffin, it's a fantastic read, but it's very dense. So you have the first couple chapters, which actually explain the story of how, all the different bankers came together under the guise of the night, and they created the Federal Reserve down in Jekyll Island. But then the other 80% of the book talks about all the fallout, why the Federal Reserve is pernicious and all these things. And that information is really strong and it really hits home. And I think that we have basically seen those lessons in a lot of Bitcoin text. A lot of the Bitcoin standard kind of has the same lessons in there about central banking. But the problem that I've had with a lot of, Bitcoin media is I just haven't seen it done concisely. I think a lot of people, they just don't have the resources or the time to just sit down and break down the perniciousness of something as deep as the Federal Reserve. And so my approach in the filmmaking that I've done is I've always tried to bring these topics to life a little bit more. And so we were all around Nashville at the time. We were all planning to go down to Nashville for the Bitcoin 2024 conference. And I thought, well, it's a 2-hour little detour to go over to Georgia. And we could check out this place and we could tell the story while we're there. The island sort of has these interesting qualities to it that sort of drive home the point of all the shady business that went on with the creation of the Fed. So lo and behold, we got a gang of great people together. Peruvian absolutely crushes it in the film. And it's touched a lot of people now. I think it has like 1.6 million on Twitter, which I wasn't expecting, or X. But it's good. A lot of people are waking up to this stuff for the first time, which is really nice.
So I'm curious then, do you think it's the last, let's say, 3 or 4 years, whether it's all the COVID stuff or the election stuff, like what do you guys think it is that is driving this, let's say, reawakening, or I guess more people who are now starting to maybe be open-minded to these ideas?
Well, I think obviously the wealth gap has grown, but I'll just take it down to a basic level. If I'm working 9 to 5, all of a sudden I see what happened during COVID. My wages barely shifted. Everything got way more expensive for me. I go on my Instagram app. I see all these millionaires and billionaires, and they're just living life. You have, I don't want to call out specific people too harshly, but, Andrew Tate with his 20th Bugatti. You have all these other business owners. You'll see stories like Jeff Bezos has the world's largest yacht. And you're thinking, hold on a second. We went through all this together. Why do these guys come out the other end way, way richer than me? Like, why did their percentage of net worth and purchasing power grow so much more than mine? And you have people from all sides basically, scapegoating, oh, it was the corporation's fault, or, the government gave too many bailouts here. And there's a little bit of like inklings of truth to all that stuff. But I think most people just haven't taken the first principles journey back to where does money actually come from? Where does the US dollar, where did that whole system actually begin? And when you take it back, you really realize that this whole thing it was doomed to fail from the start. And the same economists that we trust so much of our decision making to, we defer responsibility to them. In Canada, our prime minister said, I don't concern myself with monetary policy, like I'll leave it to the experts or whatever. And I think that's egregious. I think that's something that it's a conversation that all of us need to have a lot more frequently. To simply defer topics to, people who don't actually have a real stake in the economy is probably the worst thing that you could possibly do. And these economists, they really don't participate in the real economy at all. They have cushy jobs. They're not entrepreneurs. Maybe some of them come from investment banking, but they never actually had to suffer the consequences of the Cantillon effect. And I mean, the list goes on. But I think people are waking up to the fact that certain classes of people are excelling and actually thriving every time that inflation happens, while a massive amount of people actually suffer. So,
Peruvian Bull, what's your take, or do you have anything to add there?
No, yeah, totally. I mean, I think that's completely correct, especially that last point, right, about the over academicification of monetary policy making. You know, we haven't had a Fed governor since Volcker who even worked in the private sector for even a brief stint. All the rest have been academics and purely Keynesian theoreticians. And so when you have these people that just work on these faulty models of what they believe is true, it's easy for them to justify all of their policies. And so during COVID, we saw this mass awakening, I think, because of the financial pain that was inflicted on people writ large. There was, inflation. Then at first we were gaslit about the inflation. They said it's not happening. Then they said it was, supply chain issues, even though this was 2021 and the supply chains were starting to reset. And then we saw it's only transitory, right? That whole gaslighting thing with them saying this is only temporary. It's only going to happen a few months. And every month it kept getting worse. And then they said prices are going to come down after this. We're going to see deflation. And again, that didn't occur. And so at every stage, the people were gaslit and lied to, and then those things were proven to be lies. And that combined with the, health scare and the vaccine scare of COVID, I think it really awakened people to the fact that most of what we're taught most of what we're told from the public sector is a complete farce. And so that's, I think, started this what I've called multiple times like a mass awakening. So like almost every single sector of public life is now being re-examined, whether it's health policies from RFK or it's monetary policies from the Fed, or politics, for example. And so this causes like a reawakening of the people, and this causes much more engagement, organic engagement of topics like this. And I think that's why the documentary got and I think it's actually 1.8 million views on Twitter. Last I checked, it went mega viral, and Julian gained his channel gained like 17,000 subscribers in like short order. So there's an appetite for this kind of content because people want to know like what happened during COVID. Why did I get poorer? Why did my wages not go up with inflation? And is it ever going to change? Is this going to get worse? Those are real questions that everyday people are now asking.
So one question I think let me put this question from the quote unquote Bitcoin echo chamber, because a common thing people will say is, and there's the website about this, is WTF happened in 1971. But I think there's actually a case to say the more important thing is the creation of the Federal Reserve. So it should be WTF happened in 1913. What do you guys think?
Well, I think the 1971, it works so well because I don't think we had great statistics before 1913 that were, very, particular to months or very certain data sets, like one item of food. I think the best chart, and the one that I love, is the price of a can of Campbell's tomato soup. That's the one where we have the record going all the way back to the early I think there's a chart where it goes back to 1790. And a price of Campbell's tomato soup between 1790 and about 1971 ranged between, I think, 3 to 20 cents. It was just bobbing along. And then in 1971, you get to see kind of the exponential inflation. But I think you're totally right. I think 1913 is a pretty good checkpoint. I also think around the time of the Great Depression, you saw a lot of things change because that was the first time that the Federal Reserve really had their mettle tested, essentially, where they were said, okay, like you guys are going to be in charge of figuring this out. And I guess maybe proving you know the history in this a little bit better, but they were very late to react with, let's just say, their monetary policy in that situation. They were watching things, their data was lagging. Sounds very similar to what happened, in the last few years. And they took a while to lower interest rates into that. And meanwhile, the entire country suffered. And when history is spoken about at that time, they say, oh, thank God that we had central parties, to create the Green New Deal, or else we would have never come out of the Great Depression. Thank God we had the Federal Reserve, on their best watch, or we might have suffered another 10, 20 years of this. And it's falsifying history. It's falsifying reality. But I think, to sum it up, I think the reason people don't go far back enough is it's just the lack of data, that's as clear as 1971's points are.
Yeah, I think that's part of, obviously the Fed is in large part responsible for the Great Depression. It's almost, even Bernanke admitted that in a speech in 2013. He had a famous
Right.
quote.
Although he
when
would
was-
disagree on the reason why. He would say that because they didn't print enough, whereas we would
Yeah.
say, no, they were printing too much. So it's the opposite reason.
Exactly, but he literally said, we know the Great Depression happened, we know it's our fault, and we're sorry it won't happen again. His like literal words, verbatim. They had lowered the call window rate in the 1920s to like 2% in like 1922, and they waited till 1928 to start hiking. And by 1929 came around, the rate was still low relative to historical interest rates. And so when the bubble finally pops, there's just a massive credit collapse. And then the Fed kind of sits on their hands and doesn't really do anything for the first 2 years. And of course, we saw the failure of, 30,000, I think it was, bank and non-bank financial institutions. And that's devastating when the entire fiat system by nature is, fractionally reserved. It's fragile, right? Especially the reserve city banks. Those ones were like almost like mini central banks that acted as money center banks, holding reserves of other smaller rural banks. And if those banks failed, all the what are called correspondent banks, all those smaller banks that were relying on putting their reserves in that bank now had lost a huge chunk of their asset base. And so, yeah, this system, there's constant gaslighting that this system keeps failing because it's capitalism failing or that it's the free market failing. No, it's really the centralized money system failing because that's kind of the way it's designed to be. It's designed to be fragile and designed to be prone to bank runs and complete failures.
I think another thing to build off that as well, when it comes to statistics and like finding a good starting point and why 1971 connects with so many people. CPI, I believe, was invented like as a concept, invented around the time that the Federal Reserve came into power. They wanted to have a metric, right, so that they could accurately move their goalposts for their mandate. When CPI first started, it was measuring 40 items. It was like they said, a standardized basket. And over the years, the government has changed what's been in that basket to the point where the metric's completely useless. As soon as an item gets too expensive, they say, oh, well, there's just less demand for that item. And we're going to put, people don't eat steak anymore. So we're not going to weigh it as hard in the CPI. So it's a totally useless metric because it's not actually, it's tracking basically, just how people spend. It's always going to be artificially low because people are constantly escaping inflation by buying shittier products. And Safety goes over this a lot in his book as well. But one of the big challenges is that the free market, at least from my point of view, it doesn't have a massive need for statisticians as much as the government needs it. The government uses statistics to basically sell narratives to make policy decisions. The free market can use that data in different ways, but I don't think it's as beneficial to them as it is to the politicians who can use those statistics and use studies that they pay, a couple $1 million for to usher in billions of dollars of policy decisions. And that's why you got to be so wary of any of these things coming out of the Federal Reserve, because it's like they're designed to get one thing done, and that is to enable new spending.
On the point of statistics, I'll just quickly mention here, this is kind of a famous example within libertarian circles, but it might not be that well known. There was a governor of Hong Kong, I believe his last name was Cowperthwaite, and so there was an interesting example where he was kind of extremely against taking these statistics because he sort of had an inkling that these statistics, then they just become what's managed, and that was arguably part of what kept Hong Kong at that time, I think we're talking 50, 60 years ago, or maybe even more, relatively free from an economic perspective. And so that's an example where when there were individuals who chose not to take a lot of government statistics, guess what? There was all this economic growth anyway.
Totally. And what Julian is saying is completely right. I'm actually doing some research because I'm trying to build out a paid course right now. And one of the sections of my course is on CPI. So I had to dive in a little deeper into the CPI. And there have been 30 hedonic, like large scale hedonic adjustments to the basket in the last, or 20 adjustments in the last 30 years. So about every 18 months, they make a change. And some of the changes are like insane. Like they replace actual rental prices with something called owner's equivalent rent. And so instead of going out and saying, okay, let's go to Baltimore and find the rental prices for the median, 500 square foot and the median 1,000 square foot house or apartment, they go and ask owners, what do you think you would charge if you were to rent your house? And these are people who are not currently renting their house, nor are they paying for rent. So they're not actually like aware of the market price, and then those people give their speculative guess on what they would charge, and then they use that figure. And it's that kind of ridiculous, statistical games that they play that it constantly allows them to change the CPI basket, adjust things, use all these logical justifications, and then bring the CPI down over time, even as real inflation rises.
But I guess let me bring it back to this kind of question of 1913 versus 1971. I guess just assessing from a fundamental and economic perspective, which year's event to you is more meaningful from a degradation in the quality of our money?
1913, for sure. For sure. The creation of the
it's not
Fed.
even close, right?
No, it's not even close. And the Fed was birthed, right, out of this quote-unquote necessity to solve future financial panics because of the panic of 1907, where we saw the Knickerbocker Trust implode. There were two speculators, I think it was Heinz, and there was one other one. There were two like German speculators who were trying to take margin loans on this copper company, and the copper company failed. Their stock went down. They got called on the margin loans. That caused a run on the Knickerbocker Trust. And then once that trust failed, multiple other trusts began to fail. And the trust, again, it was a form of a shadow bank where they were lending money. They had 5% reserves to liabilities, and so very quickly they were out of reserves. And then they fail, and then 5 other contingent trusts and banks start to fail, and then they just have a widespread run throughout the banking system. And JP Morgan comes in, and he basically organizes a consortium of the banks to bail out not only these trusts, but also mainly the NYSE. They need to add liquidity to the market makers on the NYSE to actually get trades done because the market makers were running out of liquidity. And again, the idea was put forth by Paul Warburg and some of these other, I guess you could say, banking industrialists of the time who were part of the Federal Reserve Act, which was first the National Reserve Association. They all started putting out research saying, hey, look, like, we won't have JP Morgan around forever. He's our financial savior. He's our Jesus. But once he dies, we need something here permanently to essentially give us, infinite bailouts. We need a lender of last resort. And so that was the primary justification for the start of the Fed. And so after 1907, we saw the creation of the National Monetary Commission, which Warburg was a part of, as well as I think Nelson Aldrich was one of the senators involved, was also sitting on that committee. And then as that developed, they put out more and more research, putting out articles to the newspapers, opinion pieces to academic institutions. All this was just this massive propaganda campaign to tell the people, hey, we need a central bank. Like, this is not optional. And this was happening at a time when we were seeing massive antitrust sentiment throughout the country, right? This is like the 1910s. This is the Teddy Roosevelt trust-busting, anti-monopoly heyday. And so the people were very resistant to it, and that's why they had to lobby Congress again and again. And the initial act, the National Reserve Association Act, failed in 1912. And we talked about this on the podcast with Walker. There's some spicy conspiracy theory that what happened obviously later in 1912 with the Titanic had something to do with the Federal Reserve Act, because there's some prominent bankers who died on the Titanic. But that's neither here nor there. The point of it was they failed in the first attempt, and then they had to come back and try again. And they were finally able to pass the Federal Reserve Act after it was modified to make it more palatable to the public by calling it a Federal Reserve. And that was finally passed in December 1913. And at the time, I think a quarter of the House and a third of the Senate was absent for vacation. And so it was kind of passed in under the cloak of night just to get it in there.
The other interesting question that a lot of people might have is, look, it's supposed to be supposedly a private entity. So how is it that a private bank is being created by the state with legislation?
Yeah, well, that's part of the game. Is they wanted to, because again, the fear was, for one, they didn't want to give express commission to a public entity to print money, and so the idea was is this separation of money and state. Is this separate? This at least on the surface, separation of the interests. And so by making the Federal Reserve a private entity that has its board appointed by the Senate and the chairman appointed by the president, they could, at least in theory, separate these powers. And then they had this reserve association system where they have 12 district banks, and each district bank has their governors appointed by local banks in the area. And so it seems on its surface very democratic. But when you actually dig into it, it's anything but. I mean, for one, all the governor, or I think it's 2/3 of the governors on any Federal Reserve board have to be appointed by banks in the area, and they also have to have experience working for one of the banks that's part of the Federal Reserve Bank network in that area. And for two, all those banks that were in those districts, like let's say St. Louis or New York Fed, they all are forced to buy equity in the local Federal Reserve Bank. So it's like not an optional thing of, oh, we have an alternative system over here that's democratic. You can join our, if you need a lender of last resort, come buy some equity and you can park your reserves here and then we can give you a low interest rate loan if you need it. It was, no, basically at gunpoint, you are all forced to buy into this system and become a part of the National Federal Reserve Association. And so, yeah, that completely changed how the entire banks in the U.S. worked, but it also gave this veneer of democracy and quote unquote public, private separation.
And as you mentioned, that there are some big, let's say, big bankers, big industrialists, or just kind of wealthy people and influential people who were really pushing to make it happen. And I think there is this perception, it's an incorrect perception, but there's this perception that, anyone who's a big capitalist is themselves a fan of the free market. But it's actually in many cases the other way around. It's those people are using their influence inside the state to give themselves special privileges. And I think that is a really funny kind of irony when people talk about things. They sort of assume, you're a big capitalist. You must be a libertarian free market guy, right?
Well, this is the big fallacy among so many people, and if I have like one goal over the next year, it's to try and explain to people that just because there's no cap to someone's wealth doesn't mean that we live in a free market. They think that a free market is just the freedom to earn as much as possible. A free market is freedom from coercion and freedom from manipulation. If you look everywhere, the countries with the most stringent financial regulations almost always have the biggest and most undisturbed monopolies. Canada is a perfect example of this. We have basically two telecom companies that run everything. We have 4 banks that have protections from the state. We have all our hydro services are basically under one company, and we're told, we have all these things to prevent monopolies from forming, but we have statistically way more monopolies than the United States. And that's the gauge of a free market. A free market doesn't allow massive players to stay on top forever. The only way that you gain that power is you have to be able to buy politicians and affect monetary policy or jurisdictional policy wherever you are, and basically have a mouth open to guzzle what comes out of the money spigot. And it's just hard to unwind in 60 seconds in people's brains, and I try that for a living, but I think that's the perniciousness of the idea of monopolies, is that this is something that the free market creates when it's very much the opposite. And you can see it in nature. I mean, let's just say you have an alpha in a group of animals, right? That alpha eventually goes a little too far, right? And gets taken down. Other people in a pack will take them down. But if you have something that is a little bit more akin to communism, then that power can be cemented for basically ever. I don't know where I'm going with all this, but it's not a free market if a company can reign on top for dynasties, and that's just what happens under central banking all the time.
It's not a free market if it's mandated by law that they have to buy into this system. Right.
And that also, like the public-private partnership thing, I mean, if you think about it, that's sort of what the Federal Reserve is in some way. Like they tried to shoehorn in the private part of it. But I mean, those are the most pernicious companies that never adapt. Like you look at the Boeings of the world, where their number one customer is the government. 60% of their revenue comes from the government. And it means that no other plane manufacturer, no other person with a novel idea on how to do air travel or cheap consumer travel or building jets can come into the market. The economies of scale don't allow them. The regulations don't allow them, Meanwhile, you got a behemoth like Boeing, which just has a product that just deteriorates over time, but it doesn't matter because the other half of the revenue of that company comes from making missiles that just explode. It just has to get from point A to point B and pop, right? Or it just has to be a jet that doesn't fall out of the sky. They can leave the other segment of their business to basically flounder. And that is not indicative of a free market. One of the things, and this is an interesting conversation because I know, there's some conversations about whether or not Javier Milei is really like a free market guy. But one of the first things that he did in Argentina was to free up the airlines to let any other corporation come into it. And one of the things that revealed is that it's basically impossible to start a new airline in most countries that we say have free markets, like Canada or the United States or Mexico. It's basically impossible. The 2 or 3 airlines that operate domestically have a chokehold on the system, and it is almost entirely impossible to have a startup come in and be a disruptor.
Back to the show in a moment. This show brought to you by CoinKite.com, the creators of the best Bitcoin hardware security devices, such as the Cold Card Mark IV and the new Cold Card Q. Now, we use Bitcoin hardware security devices to keep our keys offline, our private keys offline. Now, the way these work is you can do that setup, write down your 12 or 24 words on the seed word cards, and keep that secure. Now, you can use this device to interact with the Bitcoin network using software such as Sparrow Wallet, Electrum, or Vector Desktop, or Nunchuck as a few examples. Now, you have a range of security features that you can use with these devices, such as passphrases, you can use seed XOR, or my favorite is multi-signature. Now, if you're starting in a basic way, just start with the device and the USB-C cable, plug it directly to the computer and use it that way, and then later improve your setup. But I believe these devices are great at helping secure your coins, especially as you start to migrate up into multi-signature security. But don't be disheartened or don't be scared away. They are accessible, and I think you actually do learn about Bitcoin in the process. So to get yours, go to coinkite.com, use code Livera to get a discount on your cold card. And now, back to the show. And the thing is, there's this kind of unholy alliance factor as well, as everyone kind of knows, because during lockdowns, during the COVID tyranny, a lot of these guys got bailouts. They were given money, taxpayer money, to stay alive. And so then if you were to try to create a competitor, at the same time, you're being forced to fund the existing, state-funded or state-bailed-out entities.
Exactly. It's like if we don't bail out the airlines, everyone's going to be stay grounded. No one can leave the country, too. They all do it under the guise of fear. That's the easiest one. The manufacturing sector. Look at all the jobs lost. People aren't going to be able to leave their houses and go to other countries. Like, it's crazy.
They act as if, a single company failing would be the end of the world, when in reality, that would be a positive reset to the system, right? Like if we saw Alaska Airlines go bankrupt, or American Airlines, which I think American was under the most stress during COVID, if they went under, what's going to happen? Okay, so they sell all their planes at cheap discount. They have to liquidate all their debt. All their bondholders get taken to the woodshed. But that's a lesson for them to not be, overloaning to a company that's barely profitable. And someone's going to come in. They're going to form a consortium. They're going to buy up all the planes. They're going to hire all the old people who are working in the old American Airlines, and then they're going to restart a new company. Maybe call it, North American or something. I don't know. And then the process will restart, and we'll have a full, like a flush of the system and a flush of all the bad executives and the bad business practices. And so it's a positive thing. Like people don't understand that a recession is actually a good thing. We want it to happen. We want the bad debt to be destroyed. And we want the bad CEOs to be fired and for their equity to go to zero, so that we'll learn to not do the bad practices that they were doing before.
And I think speaking of bondholders getting rinsed, I think there needs to be more of a conversation around government debt holders, and saying, well, you should learn to not lend to the state, right? Because there's a lot of people who just, and there's a few aspects to this, right? There's the kind of the propaganda aspect of it. There's the aspect of many people are forced because of retirement, savings accounts, pension, whatever. They're forced to save into government bonds. But that's probably a conversation that a lot of people are, let's say, they're not ready for that one yet.
Yeah. Do you think Elon Musk is holding 40% of his portfolio in treasuries? Do you think, I mean, even Warren Buffett, I don't think it's mostly equities with that guy, right? Like, none of the richest people and the most successful people in investing have a 40% bond allocation, right? And then none of the people on the other sigma that are the poorest are doing the same thing. So why do we think it's okay for everyone in the middle to be given this like crap, thing of 60%, equity, 40% bonds? It's all nonsense that's somehow been, I guess, decentralized, pushed down the pipeline by financial advisors that you got to own these things. It protects you somehow, and it doesn't. It's insane. The worst of it is the pension funds, honestly, because that's the dream that so many people in unions and these government jobs are sold, is that, the pension is that holy grail where you get to retire with dignity at 60, 70, and then you get this solid stream of income, and people line up and they make career choices around these jobs because of the pensions. And in the meantime, these pensions are taking the worst possible long-term financial advice they ever could by buying bonds. It pains me to see people line up for these jobs and take these careers with pension being one of the top reasons that they take it, when the math is so simple that if you don't invest in government bonds and you just make even like a tiny, tiny, tiny allocation of Bitcoin instead, you would vastly outperform a life of misery of holding a 4% treasury that gets devalued when the money supply goes up 8 to 10% a year.
Peruvian, I know you're aching to jump in here.
Yeah, no, I was about to say, that's completely accurate. I mean, bonds in 2020, I remember talking to my parents and they were asking me for some investment advice. And I was like, hey, at the very least, you need to get out of all these bond portfolios. And their advisors, of course, which were Vanguard and Fidelity guys, were all pushing back on me. And they were like saying, hey, wait, this 60-40 thing has worked for the last 30 years. And luckily, me being the autistic, finance reader, I was like, you're right. It has worked since 1980, since, we started lowering rates after the Volcker shock. But actually, if you backtest the inverse correlation between bonds and stocks, it does not hold up over a 70-year time frame. So you're wrong. And it definitely does not hold up during macro inflationary cycles. And then I said, we're about to enter one because the Fed's starting to ease. We're going to have deficit spending. That means real funds are going to flow into the economy. And 2021, next year, we're going to see a massive spike in inflation. And these financial advisors thought I was crazy. Luckily, I finally got my parents on my side, and because I showed them these papers. One of them was from Artemis Research, one of the best vol quant paper writers out there. But I showed them these papers, and they were like, "Okay, wow, that's a good argument." And so I got them out of government bonds, got them out of TLT, and lo and behold, 3 years later, TLT is down 50%, the long bond ETF. And so thank God I got them out of that and into safer stocks. And I even got my dad buying some Bitcoin, and he's been asking me, even this week, he was asking me to buy some more. He's like, I saw it hit 100,000. I need to buy some more. So I'm glad I've been able to kind of orange pill them in that sense. But that entire dogma has been pushed on the, financial services industry, and it's become almost like a talking point, right? Like a heuristic of, if you're in 60% stocks and 40% bonds, your portfolio is safe and you have the golden ratio, right? It's like this amazing, perfect mix of assets, when the truth is that's not the case. And so, it just shows that this industry has been, I think, completely parasitized and kind of like taken control over by state-run functions, because it behooves the state to have people buying their bonds, obviously.
And it's just such a weird, kind of coming back to what we were saying about what is really a free market and what is not, right? Because on the outside, like just at the surface level, this financial advisor and this financial planner, they're paid by this firm, and they're paid a wage and a salary, and they compete in a supposed market. It looks like a free market. People choose which one to go to, and they recommend them 60-40 or whatever. And why isn't that a free market? But actually, no, wait, there's all this regulation, there's all this propaganda. It's all underwritten by the Federal Reserve, by this central bank, this lender of last resort. There's just so many of these elements where, once you actually start peeling back a few layers, you start to realize, wait, this is not even close to a free market.
Yeah, I wrote a piece back in, and sorry, I'll go quick, and then Julian, you can hop in. I wrote a piece in I think it was April of 2024, called The Quiet Pivot, and then I wrote a subsequent follow-up called Stealth QE, where I was talking about the ways that the Fed has essentially engineered QE without actually going out and de facto doing QE. And, first it started off with post-2008, we had changes to the bank regulatory requirements called Basel III, which mandated what were called HQLA assets. And HQLA was designated as basically government bonds and agency MBS and a couple other like smaller securities designations. And so all the banks in the US had to start buying treasuries en masse. And then in 2014, the SEC made regulatory changes to money market funds because, again, the concern was back in 2008, we saw the reserve primary fund blow up and several other money market funds had severe strain and almost had to be bailed out. And so they were like, well, we can't allow these money market funds to be essentially loaning into the corporate debt markets. So now we're going to mandate that a certain percentage of MMFs become government MMFs, and those money market funds have to have 99.5% of their securities in government bonds, and mostly obviously on the short end in like 30-year or 30-day or like 90-day bills. And so what that meant is that now we had another huge buyer, several trillion, started off with like 2 trillion, it's grown up to now I think it's 5 or 5.5 trillion of money parked there. And so through the last decade, they've done all these things behind the scenes, kind of sneaking in ways to make stuff the banks with more treasuries, stuff the money market funds, stuff the pension funds with more treasuries without ever actually doing quote unquote QE. And so that's allowed them to kind of perpetuate this system. And everyone still thinks everything's fine when it's like, hey, why does Bank of America have like 80% more treasuries than it did a decade ago, even adjusting for size? Like, that's insane. These banks, what I said in the piece is that they've tied this financial noose around the banks and the treasury. So now they're all like in the same boat. So if the treasury fails, all the banks fail because now they're just loaded to the gills with this stuff.
Yeah, and I think, this might be an interesting pivot. I don't know how the size of this market will scale up, but there seems to be a concerted effort now to bring stablecoins in under that window in some sort, because they've been really, dedicated buyers of those short-term treasuries. And, Tether now, what is it? Lutnick, I think he was like the banker, Cantor Fitzgerald, for Tether. Now he's the Commerce Secretary of the United States. And I'm hearing personally that, like, if America gets behind this, and Saylor talks about this too, that this could be, there is demand realistically out there if you give people access of $1 to $3 trillion of USD stablecoins to be used in 197 other countries, and so that's just more demand for treasuries that can get passed on to people of the smallest minorities out there.
Yeah, I think that's sorry. I think that's part of the psyop of crypto, right? Like, they want people wholesale to be buying these stable coins because the entry point is, okay, use your fiat, buy the stable coins, then go gamble on, diaper coin or whatever, and then you can quote unquote try to make money. But in reality, they've been storing all your money in this stable coin, which is backed by all these treasury bills. And as the treasury is going into this cycle of exponential debt issuance, they're like, hey, we need buyers. Let's just kind of psyop the general public with crypto to become our next bag holders.
Well, it's a way to cannibalize, like underneath anything below a top 10 fiat currency as well, right? Like, if you have a super transmissible US dollar and they make it really easy to have in small countries, and they design it in such a way that, service providers in Iran can't stop this thing, then that can cannibalize the central banks of so many of these fragile countries that haven't dollarized. And there's lots of them out there. Like, if you look in South America, you have the Guyanese dollar. I think a lot of these fiat currencies, like the Peruvian sol, I think is also, the reserves are 90% US dollar. But there's a couple out there, that represent economies that have, 50 to $100 billion of GDP that still have they still have their own currency that is not tethered really to US treasuries or the US dollar. And so you make a stable coin, you spread it like a little virus in those countries, and those central banks are going to go overnight. And I actually think that in the short term, I think stable coins are going to have a much bigger effect on dismantling central banks than Bitcoin will. Bitcoin will take care of the top 10, top 20, but I think stable coins are going to just eat the rest in very short order.
This show also brought to you by Nomad Capitalist. Nomad Capitalist is a leading provider in terms of offshore tax and lifestyle strategy planning and implementation. They can help you go overseas and legally lower your taxes. As many of you know, I grew up in Australia, but I left. I was sick of it in terms of the taxes and the COVID tyranny and all these other things. And so that's why I left, and now I live in Dubai. But that's not necessarily the place for you. You have to think exactly what works for you, for your family, for your business. And Nomad Capitalists have worked across dozens of different countries. They've helped people get passports, residences, bank accounts, and all kinds of other things. And importantly, it's not just about choosing one place. It may be multiple places. And it may be also about making the pieces fit together in terms of how your business fits with your family and you as an individual. Nomad Capitalists have helped many people in terms of going overseas. And if you're interested, go to nomadcapitalist.com/apply. This is applicable for people with a net worth above $1 million US. That's nomadcapitalist.com/apply. The lead sponsor of this show is Bold, the best place to buy, sell, and save Bitcoin. For listeners in the US, Bold lets you secure your financial future with complete peace of mind by integrating a low-fee, Bitcoin-only brokerage with next-gen multi-sig vaults. With Bold, you can smash buy Bitcoin or set a DCA plan for only 0.99% fees and seamlessly deposit the Bitcoin direct to your Bold vault. The Bold Vault is a 2 of 3 collaborative multi-sig where you hold 2 keys and Bold holds 1 as a redundant backup, protecting against loss or theft. You can use Trezor, Ledger, or Cold Card hardware wallets to spin up a Bold Vault in just a few minutes, and the Bold Vault is the only collaborative custody vault available with 0 monthly fees. They're also offering 0 fees on your first $10,000 of Bitcoin buys and $25 of free Bitcoin when you buy $100 of Bitcoin or more. Try Bold today and upgrade your stacking experience over at getbold.io. And now, back to the show. Yeah, stablecoins have grown massively. I mean, last I checked, I think Tether is maybe 120 billion, 130 billion, something in that range. So as you said, if it's 1 to 2 trillion, that's like a 10x of what just Tether. And the stablecoin market is more than just Tether.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's a lot of things there. I think the other interesting element, and I think PB, you've been touching on this around this idea of the Fed as the lender of last resort, not just for the US, but for the world and the Eurodollar market as well. Do you want to comment a little bit on that idea that, you know, it's almost like the Federal Reserve is becoming the central bank for the world?
Yeah, sure. And actually, so I want to take this back to the documentary because some really interesting stuff happened when we were filming, right? Because we actually went to Jekyll Island and, you know, walked through the halls of where they actually held the meetings in November 1910. We went to the Rockefeller House. We saw the Indian Mound. We saw like all the old buildings that are kind of situated around there. And it was really interesting because in the library of the building which was the JP Morgan building where they had the meeting, there's this like bookshelf of, you know, old books, and one of the books there was you know, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And that's an old kind of, you know, 1800s Lovecraftian story about this man who's a doctor who becomes a monster. He takes this potion and becomes a monster, and then it starts to become uncontrollable, where at first he's only a monster at night, and then he starts to become a monster during the day and starts killing people, and then he can't even control when he turns into this monster. And I was telling Julian and Ian at the time, I was like, man, dude, this is such a good and the fact that the island is named Jekyll, this is such a good reference for the Federal Reserve, right? The Fed is like that doctor who comes in, who seems like a good influence and appears on the surface as a benevolent character. And then over time, he kind of morphs more and more into this 8-tentacled monster that starts to spread its tendrils first all through the US and then throughout the rest of the world. And so in the documentary, we touch on this, like, you know, the Fed started off with a very, very simple charter. And in the 1930s, their charter changes. They get, you know, they centralize control to the Washington, you know, the Board of Governors, which is located in Washington, D.C. And then they centralize all the power of setting interest rates to one bank, which before 1933, that was all decentralized. Every single reserve bank could put their own interest rate. And then in the 1970s, they adopt the dual mandate. That gives them more justification to raise and lower interest rates as they need because of either quote unquote inflation or quote unquote, you know, unemployment. And the Eurodollar market, which I've touched on in some of my research pieces, has also led to them, you know, essentially expanding their control globally, because the Eurodollar market essentially includes dollars that are floating around offshore in offshore banks and shadow banks and are being lent into existence to facilitate trade and commerce. And so what that means is that all these banks are now dependent on the US dollar system, and a lot of them will recycle their holdings into US treasuries and US bonds and US equities. And when the Eurodollar system starts to fail, when there's a run on these Eurodollar banks, they need to go and get liquidity from the actual US banking system. So what we saw in 2008 was not only a run on the banks in the US, it was a run on the global banks, the Eurodollar banks. There was a run on HSBC and Barclays. And I point out in that in one of that research pieces that, if you tally up the numbers, the Fed spent around $3.3 trillion in bailing out foreign banking institutions, which is actually bigger than what they spent on the first wave of QE for domestic banks. So it shows you that this monster, right? This Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde that the Fed that was on Jekyll Island, so appropriately named, has been morphed and it's grown more and more powerful, and its influence has just kept spreading and spreading. And the liabilities in the system have kept spreading and spreading to the point where now, the Eurodollar market dwarfs the domestic dollar market. And if there's a global financial crisis that's in the ilk of the dollar milkshake, like Brent Johnson points out, where there's a dollar crisis and there's a shortage of dollars, the Fed has to be the lender of last resort, not only for the US, but for the world, because they can't let all the banks in the UK fail or all the banks in Europe fail, because all those banks own US treasuries and all those banks own US equities and all those banks have contingent liabilities with American banks. And so they've kind of universalized their view. And that's why if you look, for example, if you break down the Fed's balance sheet and you actually look at their programs, you look at the central bank swaps, ever since 2008, every single crisis, they're funneling billions or hundreds of billions of dollars into central bank swaps. They're loaning money to Japan. They're loaning money to the ECB, to the BOE, to the Bank of Canada. It's everyone. They're having to bail out everyone. And so as the system continues, I think, unfortunately, they're just going to grow more and more powerful until we finally are able to replace them.
So do you think it's even possible to get enough people to have a populist movement to end the Fed? We have seen, I guess it's probably fair to say, the Overton window has shifted a lot in the last few years, and now there are people explicitly saying, just as Ron Paul did, end the Fed. But do you think it's more likely that the Fed sort of dies under its own steam, or do you think it's actually going to get ended by the people?
This whole issue reminds me a lot of voter reform or changing the way that elections are held. It's something that people always want and they want to change it, and then they'll get behind a candidate and the candidate will say, yeah, we probably should change this. As soon as they exact power, they're like, no, we can't change this. I won under this system. Why would I change the rules to this system? What's going to happen to me and my family and all the people around me if I change this system? And it's the same thing with central banking. There's been some really good criticism of Javier Milei. His whole thing was ending the central bank. What has Argentina done? They've printed more pesos under him. They've expanded the money supply at a faster clip. And that doesn't really make much sense if you think about their deficits are actually way down. They've cut inflation and they've cut, substantially their deficits. I think they had a surplus for the first time. So why are they printing so much money, right? Wasn't that the whole point of throwing that guy in there? And it's the same, you look at on the voting end, it's the same thing with Justin Trudeau in Canada. We were supposed to change our voting system to, I think it's first past the post, we're going to change it to ranked choice voting. And he said, yes, I'm going to do this. He gets in office. He's like, nah, we're not going to do it anymore. He resigns. He says one of his biggest regrets after resigning was not changing the electoral system to what people actually wanted it to be. And so let's just see where we're at right now with Trump. I think Trump likes the idea of himself being in charge of interest rates. He
wants them lower. He said that.
He wants them low. He wants them as low as possible. But that requires, a Federal Reserve to artificially pin them lower. The free market would not say the cost of capital is 0%, right? Or 1 or 2 even. And so I don't think we're that much substantially closer to getting rid of the Federal Reserve in the United States. I think what has changed is it is now, you're right, the Overton window has shifted. People are aware of these entities. And I think the next step is just bringing more sunlight sunlight into them. That's something that only we can do. It's nice to have some people in our corner like, Thomas Massey and Ron Paul and all that stuff, but there's only so much that those guys can do. And ultimately, if you want to repeal the Federal Reserve Act, I think it's not even like a simple majority. I think it's like a vast majority to get rid of it in the U.S. Senate and Congress, like 60%. I could be wrong on that, but at any rate, you pretty much have to have bipartisan consensus to get rid of this entity. And if those people can't even wrap their head around digital gold or Bitcoin, how are they going to wrap their head around ending the Fed? So again, it's a long process to get rid of that entity, and they can print money to make sure it doesn't happen as well. They can pay whoever they need to pay, and
there'll be interests who are very much against it, so they will work against that.
I think the only way to do it is you got to start with just bringing it into pop culture. I honestly think sometimes Bitcoiners are very autistic and funny and weird, but actually memeing Jerome Powell into things probably gets us closer to ending the Fed than tabling a bill in some ways.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think, something we talked about, when we were making the documentary was the prior times that a central bank has been proposed in the U.S. and the prior times that's been shot down, right? Post the Revolutionary War, we had the first national bank of the U.S., which was restricted by charter to not buy government bonds, and it was supposed to be just like a central bank for other local banks. But it was pushed in, right, by the Hamilton forces that wanted more centralized control. And then when when Jefferson came around, there was a whole fight between him and Hamilton about renewing the bank charter. They were initially able to slap it down, but then later on they got the second national bank started, and they got it a charter, and it lasted for 20 years until 1836. And President Andrew Jackson was able to annul the bank's charter and allow it to fail. And so there was broad public support for ending the existence of that central bank both times. And both times it was even stuck in, it was very limited in scope and was not able to do it did not have the powers or the abilities that the Fed does have today. And so that was all a result of the social pressures to resist central banking. And I think the problem is today we've been psyoped so hard, especially in the financial sector. Like if you go to a normal university in the West, from day one, it's Keynesian propaganda pounded into your head, basically until the day you graduate. And most of these people are never even exposed to alternative thinkers, to Austrians, or even to like Milton Friedman. When I was in college, I remember I was reading Hayek, and I was reading some Mises, and I was bringing it with my professor, and he's like, "Well, we don't need to worry about that." He's like, "All of that is before Keynes." So he's like, "That's unnecessary." And I was like, "That's ridiculous. I mean, are you kidding me? That's like telling me that, reading Darwin is unnecessary because Mandelbrot or some other geneticist, came before." It's like, okay, well, so I guess Darwin is unnecessary now. It's like, that makes no sense to me. And that was his logic. And so those people have this kind of propagandized view of economics, and they just have this one size fits all approach, and they can't even acknowledge other schools of thought. And so that's been pounded into our financial institutions so hard that I think it's going to take a long time to de-propagandize those institutions.
I think one of the things to look at too is like if you really look at through history, like the people collectively have never been successful at getting rid of a central bank, right? I mean, you can look at the entire scope of history as, people fighting the central banks, the Napoleonic Wars, he was trying to get the central bank under the grip, and Jackson, did his bit, but we've never been able to do it successfully. And I think it basically just comes down to, we just never had the tools to opt out of those systems. The nation state imposes its monetary system, and we have no alternative. And again, that's the beauty of Bitcoin. And if you really think about it in that lens, you realize how early we are to Bitcoin, because even right now, like, we have this great monetary tool of Bitcoin. We could technically, build a little island in the middle of the ocean and have a fully working economy with its own money that can't be dominated by a central bank. We just need a little Starlink or something. We're good to go. even right now, we don't have the tools to facilitate things that we'll still need in a normal working economy. I think lending will still have to happen, right? There's this belief sometimes that, oh, under a Bitcoin standard, like we won't have to have loans. It's just like, well, farmers have dry periods where they have to plant the seeds, and that's, where loans originated from, is agriculture. Farmers have these dry periods where the harvest doesn't come till 9 months later, and they need a ton of capital to pay for it. And so if you're an upstart farmer, you're gonna have to borrow money from somewhere. And so we're just starting to get lending tools around Bitcoin, peer-to-peer lending tools through escrow and all these things, and working with collateralization. We're just starting to get things like Fediment so that we can build other layers of currency on top of Bitcoin and just use it as a collateral device. And so, you think 16 years of Bitcoin, it's nothing. Like, we have so many more tools to develop, and once those are fully fleshed out, people will take those bold steps. They're doing it with the circular economies. However, those circular economies are still underneath nation states that, can impose their laws. Very soon, you're going to see circular economies that really try and work outside of the nation states. You have the Zeddies in Honduras, where they're trying to do that, but they're looking to repeal the Zeddy law in Honduras. But you have these little countries that are super small, and one of my predictions I made is that I think in the next 10 to 15 years, Bitcoiners will take over a sovereign nation, or there will be a group of very anti-central bank, wealthy Bitcoiners who will look to basically buy their own nation and create essentially the most free libertarian society possible. There's about, the bottom 60 countries, a lot of them are very small island nations, all have GDPs of anywhere between $50 to $400 million. I don't like coming in and gentrifying places, but there's a very real possibility that freedom-minded individuals could go and set up the first true free market economy, and the rest of the world's just going to have to swallow it and deal with it. And I think that's where we start really seeing the power of a world that's free from central bank tyranny. But that, again, it's we're so early in that mission.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a while off. But certainly, I mean, like you said, free private cities, seasteading, there are these ideas out there, and even just kind of some states breaking away, kind of secession movements and things like this. These are all possibilities, but can't expect it to happen today or tomorrow. That it's gonna take some time.
We don't have the tools yet, and that's coming. Yeah.
Right, and I think there just needs to be more adoption as well. There just has to be more adoption of Bitcoin. So I think it just comes back to that. But I think we'll wrap things up there. But I will definitely link the documentary in the show notes, so listeners, you can go and check that out. And yeah, just lastly, before we let you guys go, where can people find you online?
You can find me and the crew. Sorry, I'll go first quickly. At GetBaseTV, Instagram, YouTube, X, Rumble. We have a bunch of documentaries. We have 60-second shorts on all things Austrian economics and libertarianism and freedom maximization. And my personal tag is at Kinetic Finance as well.
Yeah, you can find me at Peruvian_Bull on X. I also have a Nostr account, and my NPub is linked in my extended bio on Twitter. So if you just go to the extended bio, my NPub will be there, and I'm active on Nostr as well. I also have a Substack. It's called $Endgame. Just look up $Endgame Substack. You'll find it. I have a free and a paid version, and then I also have a YouTube channel, which is Peruvian_Bull.
Fantastic. Well, thanks guys for joining me, and I'll catch you around.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Stephan.
Thanks so much for having us.